understand how people cope with change on the coast in Latin America. So first, I'm going to give you some context to give you an idea of how I came up with this idea and carried it out. And then I'll talk about some of the benefits and the challenges of research by sail. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of my research findings. And then I'm going to wrap it up with a sort of fun list of tips for doing this kind of thing. So I'm a social scientist and a political ecologist, or I research how nature and society shape and reshape each other, and I have a background in ecology and journalism. My research focuses on coastal climate resilience, and I'm really focused on questions of resilience for whom, at what cost, to who else. I study the power and relationships and the access to and use of shared resources. So I also look at relational values, or the values that arise from a relationship with nature. And this also encompasses personal and cultural identities associated with that. I've worked on climate projects throughout the Americas, Africa, and Europe, and a bit in the Pacific Islands as well. So my research story actually begins in the Mojave Desert, where I was working on the largest thermal solar project in the world as an endangered species biologist. So I got to work with a lot of these cute little endangered tortoises. But what the work really looked like was this, and like this. So it began to feel increasingly incongruous to me that in the name of saving the planet, we were tearing up the desert, which ended up being the home of over 450 desert tortoises, thousands of nesting birds, and the ancestral home of the Hopi, the Chemehuevi, and the Diné. So I left that project asking the question, how can we save the planet without destroying it? I knew I needed to learn more about climate change to do this, so I went back to graduate school at UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources group. So for my PhD research, I wanted to understand how coasts cope with change and how we can cope in a way that supports both nature and society. I grew up on the Bellamy River in coastal New Hampshire, which is what's pictured here. And this is an area impacted by coastal erosion and change. I wanted to do this research in Mexico. I had worked throughout Mexico in the past and wanted to continue support the coastal people there and further south in Latin America. But the main important thing, I had to be able to bring my dog. So I came up with this idea. What if I sail to Mexico? I had almost no sailing experience. Also, as you can maybe tell by this photo, Kyo, the dog, loved the water, but did not exactly love sailing. So this idea seemed like it would not appeal to a group of traditional academics. Fortunately, the Energy and Resources group is not a group of traditional academics. So when I told my colleagues at Energy and Resources group about my idea, all those folks pictured here, instead of getting shot down, they were really excited, and we would talk about all the possible ways to make it happen. So when I went to my advisor, Dan Kamen, and I somewhat sheepishly told him my idea, he listened, and then when I was done, he said, well, I guess we better find you a boat. So I started my search for a boat. I moved on to a boat and rented it in the Berkeley Marina. And I searched for over a year. And then towards the end of that time, my dog Kyo passed away from liver failure, but I was still determined at this point to follow this path. After over a year and a half of searching, I finally found this boat, and some people here may be able to recognize this. It's a Cal 39. This is a 1978 hull number 17. It was named Farniente when I got it. It was comfortable, relatively fast, and I could do yoga in the salon, all critical requirements for me. Unfortunately, on the first day of owning the boat, or really the day of the sea trial and the survey, which are pictured here with me hugging this waterlogged rudder, I met the man who would become my husband. As I hauled this boat, I really had no business owning out of the water for the first time. Josh was rowing his dinghy in the marina and grinning at me, and the rest is history. So in addition, when I lost Kyo, I thought I would just go without a dog for a while. But within a month and a half, I adopted Ulysses the sea dog, also known as Duder. This became the crew of the boat that we would rename Oleada. And that name represents our trip in a few ways. Oleada has multiple meanings in Spanish. It means both swell and uprising. And I thought that that perfectly captured the spirit of my inquiry and our journey. The idea of riding the ocean swell, but also being a part of an uprising of energy to better address climate change. Over the next 3 years, we would sail Oleada over 6,000 nautical miles. Josh first sailed the boat from Berkeley to San Diego, and I met him there. And then we continued on our sail down the coast of Baja into the Gulf of California, or Sea of Cortez, crossing at the Midriff Islands, then down the entire Pacific coast of Mexico and Central America, stopping almost everywhere we could safely anchor until we went through the Panama Canal and ended our trip in Caribbean Panama. So I had an overarching research question. How can coastal communities cope with climate change? I thought that the boat would provide shelter, a means of transportation, a bit of adventure, and the ability to bring my dog. Instead, the sailboat became a vessel to 1,000 new worlds and perspectives. It brought me together with the people, places, and beings I would have never otherwise known. And it provided the platform for understanding what it means to depend on the sea. It also altered my research questions, my methods, and my course of study. But first, I think it's an important aspect to note how this was funded. I was first funded by a Fulbright grant, specifically the Garcia Robles Fulbright for research in Mexico. This got me to Mexico to research social vulnerability to sea level rise, but I pretty quickly realized that sea level rise was not the most pressing climate topic for people in Baja. Well, what funded the majority of our time was a 2-year journalism fellowship from the Institute of Current World Affairs. So for 2 years, I sent a monthly dispatch about climate change in Mexico and Central America for publication to Washington, D.C., while I was also conducting my social science research. So understanding sailing as a research method became core to my research. In the social sciences, there are other methods or ways of conducting research that are called things like friendship as method. And I was interested in taking a self-examining and critical look at how we ethically do research in the social sciences. So I built on this tradition and called what we did sailing as method. And I intended to answer the question, what can other researchers learn about people, society, and the sea by living on and researching from a sailboat? So I came up with 3 main benefits to learning about the sea and its peoples and creatures from a sailboat. And the first benefit that I identify is embodiment. So what is this? Embodiment, in its simplest explanation, is the inseparabilities of bodies and knowledge. It is the explicit engagement with sensing our world outside of our skin, like water and animals, and acknowledging that this is central to our experiences in the world. Embodiment can be lived as in the entangled, inseparable experiences of mind and body. It can also be transcribed, where social and cultural norms play out on bodies with markers like gender or race, and I would argue climate change, which reflect existing and historical power structures. So embodiment really pushes on these binaries that we so love, like this idea of mind and body, or physical and emotional, or even personal and cultural, which in practice are not really separable. So for researchers, then, the sea isn't just, quote, the research, the thing that we study, it's something that we have to live. So these are not new concepts to sailors and fishermen, but for researchers, sailing was not recognized as a method to do this kind of thing. So embodiment was often demonstrated by people with expertise of the sea, such as with Alfonso here, with whom we went shrimp fishing. This was in Altata, a shrimp fishing town in Sinaloa, a Mexican state on the Pacific coast, made famous as the home of El Chapo, the drug cartel leader. But Altata also has the world's first certified sustainable shrimp fishery. So here they use homemade sails to drag their pangas, or open skiffs, sideways through the estuary and drag their nets along the bottom. And in this photo, you can see that Alfonso has 2 fingers on the lines for his net. And even as he and I were having a conversation, he's listening with his hands to the ocean bottom. He could feel each shrimp that he caught in his net. So finally, we also embodied climate change. And I have a specific example from Banderas Bay in Mexico. This is a popular whale watching area, but in 2016, the whales didn't visit. The water was too warm thanks to an extra strong El Nino event. And as a result, many tourism providers who would normally provide whale watching trips, they were just out of work. So tours were then rerouted to Islas Tres Marietas, which are these 3 little islands in the middle of the bay, and it's also a national park. But every day, hundreds to thousands of tourists would visit this one beach on the island by jumping off of boats with life jackets on and floating through this natural tunnel together to the beach. So for us, what this looked like was let's see if this will play, rough ponga ride, sort of slamming into the swell at high speed. It was a sort of carnival-like experience. When one cheering tourist asked if we would see whales, then the normally effusive guide became awkwardly silent and visibly uncomfortable. This was followed by the sort of terrifying experience of being carried with the swell, with a large group of people getting kicked and elbowed underwater through a narrow constriction and washed onto a small beach with hundreds of other people. It made this strong physical and emotional impression, and it was an experience directly tied to climate change. So next, sailing brought us the experience of amphibiousness. So we typically define this as the capacity to live in both marine or water and terrestrial environments. And sailing allows for amphibiousness not only between those physical worlds, but different worldviews. So it allowed for moving between and among worlds that relate and partly intermingle, but are not reducible to one another. Central to the concept of amphibiousness is flow. There are these imagined boundaries, such as those between the mind and body that we were talking about before, or between the world of me as a social scientist and the world of a fisher like Eddie here. And these would just flow into each other as part of the research. So the spaces where they meet can be turbulent and tense, as well as productive, kind of like an upwelling. So the world of Alfonso is different than the world of Jess. And instead of saying, we see the world differently, a way of thinking that really reduces Alfonso's worldview to something that isn't quite as true as mine, amphibiousness acknowledges that these are actually different worlds. And that's what social scientists would call ontological multiplicity. But that's the only time I'm going to say that silly group of words together in this presentation. So as an example of amphibiousness in practice, I was conducting research as a social scientist, right? But I was also a sailor where I abided by important seafaring rules, what might otherwise be called superstitions. These included never leave on a Friday, never point out and say how CALM it is. These are not to be violated. And more than once we delayed our departure to avoid leaving on a Friday. So I would have these paradigmatic flows between my research worldview and those worldviews of the people who made us a part of their worlds. But this was also happening in me internally as a researcher and me as a sailor bound to these inviolable traditions. Next, and finally, for sailing as method, there is a critical engagement with context, a context that is historical, cultural, and political. It's what the writer Amitav Ghosh calls the insistent vitality of the past. So boats under sail represent a long history on these coasts, stretching back 500 years to Spanish and Portuguese colonization, which was made possible by sailing ships. There is also what sailboats represent now for communities. Whoops. Based on their experience with other sailors. So these contexts were pretty uncomfortable for me and brought me to be aware of what Linda Tuhiwai-Smith addresses as research through imperial eyes, which is an approach which assumes that Western ideas about the most fundamental things are the only possible ones to hold, certainly the only rational ideas, and the only ideas which can make sense of the world of reality, of social life and human beings. So amphibiousness allowed me to let go of this worldview and be more open and curious. But I was uncomfortably aware that I was conducting research using a method, using sailing, that held the weight and the vitality of the past. And I was also aware that I was uninvited on these shores. And this tension led me to ask the question, who does this research serve? At what cost to whom else? And context was a critical element of that. In my conversation and interviews, it became increasingly apparent that the impacts of climate could not be understood without tracing the history of the past, of a place. So history is a subjective thing. The conditions and events that lead to, for example, a depleted fishery might be told differently from a fisheries manager or a 6th generation fishing family or a blue whale. This is the decentering of context, getting into these unclear spaces and building my own reflexivity as a researcher. So reflexivity, what's that? It's exploring my own cultural identity and how it impacts my interactions. So it really not only about exploring the structure and the cultural history of a place, but how my own cultural constructs and biases interact with that. Now, there are also challenges to researching by SAIL, and I pick out three main challenges here. The first is reciprocity. So in social research, a person gives us their time and their perspective. And I encountered and spoke with many people along a vast area. How do I give back? This is an ongoing interest, but something that sailing as a method itself has not yet given me. So there's also access. Sailboats are a hole in the water you throw money into. Ours was a 40-year-old boat, and my husband is a shipwright, and we still struggled to make all the necessary repairs. So there's access to capital to fund an expedition like this, but there's also access to skills and knowledge. Learning how to sail is one thing, knowing how to maintain the boat is another enormous set of skills. I didn't know how to do either at the beginning of this expedition. I could lean on my skills from the past as a backcountry guide, but that said, this expedition would have likely put me in mortal danger more than a handful of times without my husband's expertise. I think there were two main ways to address this challenge. First, you don't actually need a sailboat to integrate embodiment, amphibiousness, and context into research. These are active practices that can be done in reflexive and co-productive partnerships and communities. But second, there are ways to do sailing far more minimalistically than we did, with simpler boats and fewer systems. But on a sailboat as a researcher, I think one needs to consider this final challenge, which is pace and uncertainty. Give me just a second here. Sailing is not the fastest or most thorough way to collect data. In fact, sometimes it felt like the least fast way to collect traditional social science data. We had a few encounters even where we would meet someone, I'd planned to come back and interview them, and then we couldn't get to shore the next day because of conditions. What I ultimately had to discover was that I was conducting a critical ethnography of the sea, or observations of my environment with reflexivity. And this frustration that I was experiencing was part of my ethnographic experience. So what can this emergent method do? First, it centers stories and narratives. So I'm going to start with a story about Domingo here. And this is perhaps the most important story I think I will tell you in this presentation. It was a pivotal moment in my research. I met Domingo in Bahia Honda in Panama, which is a very remote and rural community on the Pacific coast. It's an island in a very small protected bay, and you can only access the entire area either by a couple-hour boat ride or a footpath that takes multiple days over the mountains. And I was talking with him on our boat and asking him questions about climate impacts in his community. I was asking him about what I thought was important about climate change, these biophysical impacts, sea level rise, warmer temperatures on land and in the sea, changes in fish species. And at one point, he just slammed his fist on the table and said, no, these impacts are not the challenges for my community. We need healthcare. We need education. So how I was thinking about climate change, these biophysical impacts and their technocratic solutions were not how he lives climate change. Instead, for him, it was a more pressing social justice issue, this continual lack of access to healthcare and education, which was exacerbated by climate impacts and perhaps further entrenched. But what he was telling me was that to build community climate resilience, he needed me to first listen to him and hear his community needs. Next, sailing as method encourages the questioning of paradigmatic assumptions or these worldviews, making assumptions about other people. This idea that there's only one world and only one way of understanding and living climate change. This just isn't the case, and living with the sea helped me understand this. And then finally, it engaged with flow. It allowed these tensions and stories and between worldviews to exist. So this experience with sailing framed the methods and results for my research on how coastal communities cope with climate change, which is a little bit of what I'll talk about next. So in the world of climate adaptation, there was a common challenge across scales and geographies. How do we actually measure climate resilience? How do we know if a project is effective at meeting climate adaptation needs? I took a knowledge co-production approach to try to answer this in a way that served the needs and interests of Mexican and Central American communities. And I did this using social science methods. I conducted 40 semi-structured interviews, which means I had an interview guide, but I could deviate from it, and we certainly did. I also had ethnographic interactions or observations by immersion in communities in more than 70 communities, as well as numerous conversations and experiences just bobbing on our boat in coastal and offshore waters. I also cited a few of the hundreds of journalism interviews that I conducted for my research. But what is resilience? If we use the definition from the social ecological systems community, it is the ability of a system to absorb disturbance and maintain function or transform. But what really dogs this definition, I think, resilience in general, is resilience for whom? At what cost? To whom else? To address this, I turned to a group of scholars who are anthropologists, political ecologists, indigenous studies scholars, and ecofeminists, and they all integrate care. To understand this, I start with a definition here from Joan Tronto, and it's used by this other woman who's written a lot about care, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa. And care is everything that, it includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Care is moving from caring about to caring for. It is affective or emotional. It embodies ethical considerations, and it's also practical. It includes the everyday, the mundane, and the less glamorous aspects of what caring for something can sometimes be. Now, with this framing in mind, what did people tell me was important for their resilience? Now, there are 4 ways that communities said reflected what makes them resilient, and I'm going to break them down with some explanations and stories for examples. The metrics came down to relational care, which is really whether or not community members were able to identify with each other and take care of each other. Next, there is network care. The previous relational care is about connections within the community, and this is all about connections to the outside world. There's also place-based care, which really means having access to services, things like education and healthcare. And finally, there's inclusive care, or opportunities that are good and available for everyone, especially women, Indigenous people, and youth. So relational care, a word that often came up in my interviews in Spanish, is conciencia. And in this case, what that means is essentially taking care of each other. These were themes of belonging, responsibility, reciprocity, trust, interconnectedness with ecological communities, and contextual identities tied to past ways of knowing and doing. It included community identity, often as something that had been lost. It also included everyday care. Very frequently, people brought up attention to trash as an example of care. And I have a quote I'll read for you here, translated. We contribute to a sense of community by planting more trees and not littering our trash. When I go to Juncalito, when I see trash on the ground, I pick it up because I don't like it when they say, oh, that's a filthy community. So I like to pick up the trash that's there. Now, this photo is from Isla Pardito, a tiny island in the Gulf of California, where really small communities still exist, at least for the moment. So even as the children of the folks from this island have moved on to land-based work, they still visit frequently and support the community. Also, it was on Pardito that I started to get a better understanding of what gets valued in many coastal communities here. On this tiny island, there are so many houses, just feet from the water. I asked one of the men there, what do you do when there's a tropical storm? Because they have tropical storms and hurricanes that move through the Gulf every year. And he replied, oh, we pull the boats up higher. So to them, the houses are not their main concern. It's the transportation, the boats that get them to supplies, but also keeps them connected with their families and friends who are in the communities of the island. Next, there was network care or external social connectedness. For an example, in a small Mexican town, one of the people I interviewed had an ecotourism business, and he faced development threats for the forests and the wetlands that were essential to his business. He was a bird watching guide. So through two international non-governmental organizations, he received training on business plan development and implementation. And then he also had an international exchange that would bring tourists from Oregon to his area along, and that group would also bring him to the US for technical training. So through this regional training and community-based management, the interviewee gained the social and economic support to organize opposition to wetland development. And he ultimately ended up preserving his business along with a town resource. And then examples of this abounded from my research. There was a fishing community, Altada, that was connected with an international non-governmental organization that supported that certification to make it the world's first certified shrimp fishery. There's also the story of an island fisherman who, given his interactions with researchers and non-governmental organizations over 20 years, ended up changing how he perceived the natural world. And now, instead of fishing, he offers an ecotourism experience at the island. Next is place-based care, this access to healthcare and education. Health and education needs came up over and over, and participants often steered the conversations toward these issues. I cannot stress this enough. My interviews were intended to capture the biophysical impacts of climate change and how people adapt. And instead, people steered me towards their real concerns. For education, people were interested in seeing high school level in their communities and tailored to their communities. I have a quote from the community of Agua Verde. She said, "Now, thank God we have a high school. We're so happy about it. Many people come to our high school, married women, people who did not finish grade school. There are many women, young and old, who were not able to study because their parents did not want them to go to Loreto or Constitucion because they were too young. Now they are able to study here." There was also healthcare. There were so many barriers in many of these communities, such as finding finances and time to be able to travel to healthcare, accessing appropriate care, and as well as this idea of culturally tailored education about at-home treatments. This is a quote I have. "Yes, I have concerns about my sick family member. As I was telling you before about money for medicine, one worries a lot when sickness is involved, right? This worry and the lack of money are my concerns." This is what I have been trying to tell you. As you can see, people, they really had to beat me over the head with this for a little while until I finally got it. And then finally, there's inclusivity, inclusive caring, which in this case could be measured by equity and economic activity. And what I mean is most coastal communities embrace diversified economies. However, opportunities for good work, specifically for younger generations and women, were often not available or promoted within communities. And the lack of equity presented the lopsided nature of development and change that in communities that would otherwise appear resilient. Now, as an example, in some communities, like the one pictured here, women were business owners. This gave them economic and political leverage in their communities. And in other communities, women were part of an industry such as tourism or fishing, and in some cases, their hours were incredibly long and strenuous, and it kept them away from their families while they did really menial labor. And these were communities that would otherwise appear to be thriving both economically and ecologically. But when I talked with the women, they were bearing the brunt of the labor to support these appearances because they didn't have other options. There was also an issue of equity in development for communities. And I have a quote here from someone in Nicaragua. "I think that due to the arrival of tourism in this area, I think there may be a more positive impact, but with less access. In other words, it may improve because tourism tends to protect nature, the environment, it tends to bolster it. But really, as villagers, we will have less access to that." So many systems saw income diversification, but again, questions of resilience for whom, at what cost, to whom else, appeared to have taken a backseat. So these metrics require a process that is user-driven, and that means that how we as researchers and planners come up with metrics to measure things, that this process matters. The methods that I used gave participants the opportunity to shape my research and really elevate their actual concerns about climate resilience. Next, community climate resilience is just inextricably linked with concepts of care. This framing of climate change as biophysical impacts with technical solutions did not fit how people were experiencing or living climate change on the coast. Concepts of care help to better center their needs in this research and hopefully center their needs in future actions. And then finally, more broadly, resilience and any associated metrics are riddled with challenges, including definitions of resilience limiting discourse and disempowering certain groups. So an approach to metrics that integrates social methods and processes has the potential to draw out and make clear the limitations of resilience and thus explicitly recognizing them. Okay, so now I'm going to shift away from the research and move into some of the fun lessons learned. These here are 11 tips for research by sail, should you ever want to do this. I think these are also, they largely apply to our philosophy on cruising or sailing over long distances and how to cruise well. So these are really just important lessons learned for us. First, stop everywhere. Go to all the places that no one goes to, especially the places that people tell you not to go to. These for us included El Tata, all of Nicaragua, and Honduras. We had the most extraordinary experiences getting guided around an island by a group of local kids. You still have to be savvy and always aware of your surroundings. And you don't have to be a researcher to be curious, to have the mentality of listening and learning. Next, we made our boat open to visitors. If people stopped by, we invited them aboard within reason. And many of our visitors were kids, but we also had many sails with new friends and invited people over for dinners. For example, in Bayonda, this guy named Kennedy had never had spaghetti before, and I'm not sure that he liked it, but he definitely liked the cake that we gave him. Then as an addendum to this, let's see if this will play. Maybe it won't. As an addendum to this, always let kids read your books, jump off your boat, play your musical instruments, and definitely have things to give them. We always tried to carry things to give to people. For kids, this meant magazines and books. And for fishers, we would sometimes be approached 20 miles offshore by men in a panga. And although it would make me nervous, the men in these boats invariably just wanted to check out our boat, and they always needed drinking water. So we tried to have bottled water to toss to them. Next, row your dinghy to shore. Rowing our dinghy got us so much instant street cred or ocean cred. In Baja, we rowed to shore at one of the first little towns we came to. And as we were rowing our way back to the boat, a panga full of people going home to the next village came by and picked us up. They had us grab on and they toted us to our boat. After that, word spread ahead of us. Our dinghy was often admired, and it was a starting point for many conversations. It was also sometimes a very exciting way to get to land. There were other times where we attached a motor to this dinghy for those extra long commutes, but not having that motor was also a great way to minimize the things that could be stolen, and it also just created a point of connection. Next, you can't ever have enough anchor lights. In the Bocas del Toro archipelago, we were eating pizza in our cockpit right after dark one night. It's not a particularly busy anchorage, but we heard the drone of an outboard, and it was getting closer and then really close, but we still couldn't see anything. We had our anchor light on, our cockpit lights, and we only saw the cayuco right before it hit us. A cayuca is a motorized canoe, often made out of one huge log, so they can be 30 feet long and weigh a ton. And this is a pic of Josh in the bow of our friend Eddie's cayuco. And Josh is not a small guy, he's 6'2", so they're pretty big. The one that hit us full throttle rode up into the cockpit where we were sitting. The lifeline caught it before it hit me and repelled it back. We couldn't immediately see the driver. He was knocked out in the bottom of his boat. And when he came to, he was saying, abuelo, abuelo, which means grandfather. So I thought he was telling us how to find his family. But Abuela was also the name of the national rum in Panama. And that was what he was talking about. He was super drunk and had just hit us. So he got his motor going and puttered off, but we had a sizable hole in our deck, though fortunately far above the water line. All this is to say that it's a good idea to know about anchorages, and being nice and bright even at water level is also a great idea. Next, know what a tidal overfall is and avoid them. When the tide flows over a shallow seabed or another current, this is known as a tidal overfall. I don't have any images of this because I was white knuckle holding on, but in the Midriff Islands in the middle of the Gulf of California, we were in 200 feet of water and suddenly found ourselves surfing breaking waves. Now, fortunately, Josh is a good surfer and Oleada turned out to be a good surfer too, but looking up behind us in the cockpit at some steep breaking waves was something that we would have liked to have avoided. Next, travel with a buddy boat. For much of our passage all the way down to Panama, we traveled intermittently with John and Shannon aboard SV Prism. And we knew them from the yard. Alicia knows them as well in Berkeley. Getting to share this experience with them not only made them family to us, but it made the experience even more saturated and fun. It doesn't hurt that these two are some of the most adaptable, fun, and funny people I've ever known. And this is a photo of Oleada in the Miraflores locks in the Panama Canal with John and Shannon helping us as crew. Having a buddy boat was also just safer. We were traveling to many off the beaten places and in the off season or the rainy season at that. So we could help each other plan, fix boat problems, and even feed each other. Next, quality takes time. I learned this phrase in a moment where I was really struggling. I came out of our salon after having a very upsetting conversation with my editor for my grant, and a friend was helping us with repairs on Oleada on deck. And he looked up at me and with just the slightest hint of a smile said, "Quality takes time." And time is something I often wrestled with on our trip. I wanted to get to the next place and learn more and to talk to more people and see more places and do more things. But in the end, that often wasn't the safest or really the best way to approach what we had this opportunity to do. And often the sailboat just wouldn't let us do that anyway. Next, we visited some incredible places when we would get away from the boat. In Nicaragua, we learned so much more about the coast by getting to other villages that we couldn't access by the boat and seeing how people were living in more interior places and on other coasts. In Mexico, we went and visited a coffee finca in Chiapas on the Guatemalan border. And it was a different way of life and lived experiences that continued to inform and shape how I understood Mexico and climate change in Mexico. The benefits of pet ownership seem to increase 10 or 100-fold when you are at sea. Ulysses the sea dog made us laugh all the time, even when we were tired and grumpy. He might have a few quirks like a deep love of rolling in bird poop or jumping off the boat when he hears a loud noise, which is a problem when you're underway. But he's an excellent snorkeling companion, which is amazingly true, a snuggler, and he was an ambassador to adults, kids, and other dogs. Dogs also have the excellent additional benefit of ensuring that you will get off the boat and go to shore at least twice a day, because people will sometimes spend weeks not going to shore. Most of all, Yuli grounded us and helped us enjoy the amazing ocean around us. For example, Yuli barks at dolphins. He loves them. So we would see dolphins maybe every half hour or more on all of our passages. When we would meet up with other cruisers at our destination, they would tell us that they hadn't seen dolphins in months, despite having taken the same route as us. There's also one more benefit in that Yuli gets to have a great life. Next, pick up more. Getting our second dog, Rana, was one of the most challenging and important learning experiences of our entire trip, and it could be a whole presentation in and of itself. She was the worst looking dog we saw on our entire trip, and I had to have her. It took some negotiating, but she ended up coming home with us. She has been our most loyal companion and such a joy to have in our lives, and I can't imagine what her or our lives would be without her. And then finally, we had some crew that was really great and others that were really not so great. But the best decision I ever made was buying that boat, because it brought me to the most good-natured, quick-thinking, calm, kind, and adventurous partner. What we did and the scale of it would have never been possible without him. My research took up a lot of time, and it's already a more than full-time job to maintain and sail a boat. So we worked as a team, and we continue to be a team. So there you have it, a little glimpse into what we learned researching by sail. Thank you for coming along, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have.
Jess, that was so, I've been waiting for this presentation, and anyway, thank you so much. I want to ask you, my first question is, or the first question that I have for you is, I was hoping that you would share a little bit more about what it is really actually like to sail with a dog.
I think it really depends on the dog. It really does. So what we did was we put up netting all around our lifelines, because Yuli, when he hears a loud noise or just a noise that he doesn't like, his safe place is in the water. And so he, no matter where we are, we could be 25 miles offshore. He hears the water pump turn on in the boat, he runs out and goes to run off the back. So that was one of the things that we had to do. One of my most memorable moments, though, was a night watch. He would stay in the cockpit with us, and we would have him have his life jacket on, and he would also be clipped in just like we were. But we had dolphins join us for 45 minutes on the bow, and so he and I walked up to the bow together, and there was so much bioluminescence, and he just barked his little head off, and we watched the dolphins together for 45 minutes. So it's just really special to be able to, you know, I'm sharing this experience with a dog and the dolphins and the boat. Really just magical. So yeah. Oh, the other thing, but you're probably wondering about sort of like, where does a dog pee and where does a dog poop? We had a little AstroTurf square on the bow of the boat, and that was his spot. And getting him to use it the first time was a little bit of a challenge, but he did figure it out. And so he would use that
Did
spot.
we stretch him across both?
Oh, I thought I heard someone say something. So yeah, so that's some of the logistics of it as well.
Yeah, I love it. And so, Jess, here you are in Berkeley, California. You just bought the Cal 39, and like, when you were embarking on this adventure, did you realize that you were going to be sailing for X amount of years, or what was your initial maybe voyage plan?
I think my initial voyage plan was just to get to Mexico. And when I initially applied for the Fulbright, it didn't necessarily even involve the boat. And so I was based in La Paz in Baja California Sur. And then when I learned about the opportunity with the Institute of Current World Affairs, that's when I came up with the full-fledged plan. And we had, in fact, hoped to keep going throughout the Caribbean, but for a number of reasons, we ended up staying mostly in the Pacific, which was plenty of places to visit. So we really started thinking about, okay, let's just get to Mexico. And then from there, we were able to get a little bit further.
And where is your boat now? Where is the boat that you traveled on?
This is a pretty sad story. What happened with the boat was when we were in Caribbean Panama, we became pregnant, and I was like, let's keep sailing. And then after 3 months of just lying prone on the boat and only being able to eat applesauce and hard-boiled eggs, I was like, enough of that. There was also a lot of Zika at the time, and so that was a real challenge to deal with as a pregnant person. So we took the dogs with us and we came back to the US, and then a friend sailed our boat from Panama to Florida for us. And there, the boat, we kind of became a little bit wrapped up in what I guess is probably insurance fraud. The boat became damaged in a storm, and we looked to our insurance company to fix it, and they wouldn't do it. So we ended up having to sell the boat because there was just too much for repairs. And now we have a beautiful 4.5-year-old daughter, a couple of dogs, and a smaller boat, which is also really great, a North Sea 27 that is in Round Pond with us.
So I'm going to give folks a few more moments to ask some questions in chat. And I'm going to, yes. Just most significant learning while on this adventure that you would share with all of us. Some of us are sailors, some of us are not.
Most significant learning, as in, you know, what's the most important thing that my biggest takeaway?
Yeah.
Probably it's, you know, who you do this kind of thing with really matters, whether it's just yourself or the right people, because I highlighted that in the end too, that doing this with Josh made it really easy. And we encountered other couples and other people sailing who were struggling because for whatever reason, it wasn't a good fit for all of them. But I think also along with that is the people we met were so important to me and to us. And so it was really ended up being all about the people. So getting to shore as often as we could, getting to as many places. And I mean, when we went to Altada, people would just come over to us on our boats and say, thank you so much for coming to our town. We're so glad you're here. We had another example where we anchored somewhere where people just never go. And someone called us on the radio and he said, you were like a flower in our garden. It's so good to see you out there. So, I mean, we were just really embraced everywhere we went. It was such a gift. So it was really all about the people on the boat and the people ashore.
Here's a question for you. How could you leverage the regular cruising community to supplement your data?
That's a great question. I sometimes struggled to interact with the regular cruising community because people weren't really going ashore very often and weren't necessarily engaging with communities. But I think that there are a lot of ways, and there are a few people out there who are asking cruisers to gather data, and whether that's sort of that biophysical data about the ocean or observations that people are doing that. And I think in retrospect or in doing it again, it would be interesting to have interviews with cruisers to understand their impressions of place and the sea, and, you know, their place in it.
And this is a really great question that I'm really curious about, but what are your plans from now on? What are you, Bella, up to?
Well, so I just finished my PhD at UMaine Darling Marine Center. I was advised by Dr. Heather Leslie. Thank you. And that was a great experience. And I'm now working as the Climate Services and Assessment Fellow at the Aspen Global Change Institute. And I think ultimately my family would like to still continue to contribute and work in Mexico and point south and working in climate spaces. And so a lot of the research and the work that I've done has been on topics that have been specifically asked for, especially by funders and aid organizations, you know, like, we don't know how to measure resilience. Can you help us figure this out? So these are the kinds of ways that I'm hoping to give back to those communities. As far as being back on a boat, anybody who has a 4.5-year-old knows about or has been around one can imagine the whims and the nature of living with a young person. And so we talk a lot about how we would potentially like to be and live on a boat again. And for now, we're just thinking about, you know, just how to keep her safe anywhere she is, whether it's on land or on a boat. But I think also too, I should say, if we had the opportunity to do this again, we would do it.
All right, I have a few more questions for you. What parallels do you see between the challenges faced by the coastal communities you visited and this one and those around us in Maine? Were there any of those connections that surprised you?
Yeah, there are many parallels and also many differences. Culture and sort of cultural heritage plays such a big role in how people interact with the sea. And it is, I think, really, it's all, you know, in Maine, there's a deeper, I feel like Mexicans and a lot of the Mexican communities, people are very practical about their livelihoods. And so when I would ask fishermen, you know, would you want to give this up? They're like, yeah, if I had a better paying job, like I like my job as a server better. And so there was this practical way of moving through it. Whereas I feel like in Maine, I think there is a recognition of the value of being on the water and wanting to maintain that and maintaining that sort of autonomy that being on the water and on a boat allows. So that's both a similarity and a difference. Sort of recognizing the culture surrounding living and being on the water. And then because of COVID, I haven't really had the opportunity to do the kind of work that I was wanting to do that was really looking more comparatively at the coast of Maine and the coast of Mexico, especially in Baja. But I think it would be really such a neat opportunity to be able to connect fishermen in both places and fishing families in both places, because there are some neat ideas and some ways that people go about fishing that they would share some similarities and also learn about differences. So that's a little bit vague, but I think that would be interesting for people to actually be able to talk about with each other.
Jess, in your experience, is ecotourism a fallback for economically struggling communities? Basic needs are so important. Economic diversity keeps separating humanity.
So that's a great, I love the question. I've been to these before and the questions here are so amazing. So that's very perceptive. Ecotourism and tourism in general is such a huge focus at every level, especially at the federal government level throughout Latin America. So they don't just have the Secretary of Interior or Agriculture, they have a Secretary of Tourism. And so this is extremely important to them. And so promoting ecotourism is really just built into almost everything on the coast, and trying to bring more tourism to different areas. A lot of it is national level tourism. But yes, I think that not only is tourism a fallback, it's also the first, it's also the focus in many of these places. How that has gone with COVID, I don't know, because I haven't been able to travel there, but I have felt concerned. And I do think that people are, again, traveling and still traveling nationally within borders. And that is where a lot of the bread and butter for some of these smaller communities we visited comes from. But yeah, tourism is huge.
This one, can you apply your methods to Bristol and your research methods?
So I would, yes. So I've been working with the state of Maine, talking about especially resilience metrics that are focused, you know, the resilience metrics that I told you about, and having folks thinking about that. So I would love to support Bristol with any of this research. And in fact, hopefully we'll be able to do so by supporting the work of the Comprehensive Planning Committee, and in whatever capacity is desired.
All right, this is going to be your final question. Can you say more about your experience with the legacy of colonialism?
Yeah, in fact, that was before I chose the word decentering, decolonizing my research was really a focus of something that the sailboat really brought into focus for me. So a lot of that is about that reflexivity of my own cultural constructs and biases. And I think it's something that there's not very much literature on. And so it's something that I would be developing, talking with other people and building on literature, especially in Indigenous studies, on understanding, you know, but they, instead of the universe, they call it the pluriverse, and understanding the pluriverse a little bit better. So that's something that I'm still, it's just going to be a piece of lifelong work. So I might be able to publish on it or whatever, but it's something that I will continue to be learning about.
Love it. Jess, I can't thank you enough for this evening, and great presentation. I really loved what I learned. I loved having all of these folks here tonight, and thank you so, so much.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions at all. I'd be happy to talk with each and every one of you. So thank you.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jess.